"The ATM card. Where is it? Let me take care of it," Scott responded, his voice composed yet exuding an air of authority. Lying on the hospital bed, I was fighting cancer, and the treatments had left me weak and exhausted. I felt nervous as he received the card, his face betraying a faint, triumphant smile. Now that he had my ATM card, his expression suggested he might be planning something on his own. "To give you an idea, that account has $800,000. Carefully handle things," I advised him, attempting to put my faith in him as my spouse. I had a strategy in place, but I was also hoping he would be supportive. In spite of the danger, I had deliberated and chosen to trust him. Upon leaving the hospital, I returned home to gather a few items. Surprisingly, though, I discovered a divorce petition resting on the table. My worst fears were confirmed, and my heart plummeted. The ATM card and all of our joint creations were stolen by Scott. Nonetheless, I refused to let myself feel defeated and instead viewed this as the catalyst for my personal strategy to resist. I am Shirley, a woman in her 50s, and this is my narrative. I believed I had a great husband in Scott when we initially got married. He gave out an accommodating vibe. Our marriage went off without a hitch for the first 3 months, but then everything started to change. His actual character started to emerge. Scott gave the impression that he thought a wife should prioritize her spouse above all else. This demeanor gradually exposed a shadowy aspect of his character. Using his words as weapons, he became demanding and aggressive. "A wife should always listen to her husband," was his favorite saying. He would become angry and accusatory whenever I deviated from his strict instructions, and he would make me feel like a failure as a result. When it came to domestic duties, he had quite particular requirements. Ignoring my exhaustion and busy schedule, he insisted that I wash his clothes separately and clean his room before attending to any other part of the home. He began to demand even meals. "A wife's job is to make what her husband wants," he'd remark, but there were occasions when he'd sneak out of the house without warning me that he wasn't in the mood to eat the food I'd prepared. His actions left me feeling both irritated and worn out. I felt like I had to tread carefully at all times, attempting to win him over, but I was never really successful. Our relationship would become more strained at home with every error I committed. It was wearing me down to live this way. I became lightheaded and passed out one day while trying to finish all of the things he insisted on. I stumbled and made a ruckus that frightened our next-door neighbor. After they contacted the building management, he came to see how I was doing and promptly dialed for an ambulance. It wasn't until I woke up in the hospital that I realized how stressed and exhausted I had been. There and then, I realized it was up to me to be the boss. They admitted me for testing the moment I stepped foot in the hospital. My initial optimism that they wouldn't uncover anything major soon dwindled. It was a devastating blow when the doctors told me I had cancer. I knew I was in a horrible condition, but I couldn't put my finger on whether it was stress-related. I needed a nurse to help me stand up and sit down because I was so lightheaded. I attempted to phone my parents after the doctor advised me to do so. The problem is that my mom died a few years ago, and my dad is now staying with my brother and his wife, which is 5 hours distant by plane. They couldn't possibly arrive fast. I opted to contact my husband, Scott, since I felt completely powerless. No one ever got back to me after I left a message. My guess is that he may not see it immediately, as he had apparently disabled alerts for texts sent by me. Despite the fact that I was in need of a change of clothes and some toiletries, I decided against attempting to retrieve them on my own after the doctor warned me against it. Scott said, "I'll come to the hospital tomorrow," in a quick message that he sent to me hours after the fact. Hold on a second. I was concerned that he wouldn't even take my belongings with him after reading his emotionless message. Scott still hadn't responded to my repeated requests that day to fetch my possessions. Since I was hospitalized without any personal belongings, my need was immediate. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of waiting, he received my messages and responded with the surprising words, "Shut up and be quiet." His response was so hurtful, especially knowing I was hospitalized and dealing with a cancer diagnosis. I felt disappointed, but I shouldn't have been surprised. Scott had never shown much care, but part of me still held on to a little hope. The first day in the hospital was rough, made worse by Scott's lack of support. The nurses saw my distress and tried to comfort me, but their kindness only made me feel worse, like a reminder of what was missing in my marriage. The next day, around noon, Scott finally showed up. He looked at me and said casually, "You look healthier than I thought. I expected you to be more frail." His comment hurt, and I couldn't hold back my anger. "Just put down the bags and leave," I told him, trying to stay calm. Scott looked confused. "What bags?" he asked, as if he had no idea what I was talking about. My frustration grew. He hadn't even brought my things after I'd clearly told him I needed them. I glared at him, unable to hide my anger. He noticed my look and snapped. "What's that look for?" His indifference was pushing me to my limit, but I took a deep breath and tried to stay composed. "If you didn't bring my things, why are you here?" I asked, feeling a mix of sadness and frustration. Scott responded to my angry question with a casual, "I had another errand." "Another errand? What was so important?" I asked, feeling exhausted and drained after a sleepless, stressful night. I waited, watching him hesitate as if he was deciding whether to tell me the truth. "If you have something to say it now," I insisted. Finally, he let out a small laugh and said, "Where's the ATM card? Let me manage it. Trust me." His real purpose became clear in that moment. He had come here not out of concern for me, but to get control of the ATM card and seize our savings for himself. His self-centeredness, even in this situation, made me feel a deep sadness. Yet Scott stood there, smiling as if nothing was wrong. Unable to bear his behavior any longer, I made a decision. "There's $800,000 in that account." I told him firmly, "Take care of it." Scott's eyes lit up with surprise and greed. To give some background, both Scott and I had worked regular office jobs before we got married, and we didn't make much money back then. So where did this $800,000 come from? The answer was stocks. After I became a housewife, I started investing in the stock market on a friend's advice. I did this quietly while taking care of the house, and recently I made a large profit. Initially, I wanted to keep this money hidden, afraid of what Scott might do if he found out. But now, my desire for revenge drove me to tell him. Seeing his greedy reaction confirmed my suspicions. "The ATM card is in the third drawer of the shelf," I said with a gentle smile. "Go ahead, take it." Scott looked stunned, but quickly regained his composure. "Understood," he replied with enthusiasm. It was clear he thought he was winning, not realizing he was stepping right into my trap. "I'll leave everything to you," I said as he left the room, clearly excited to get his hands on the money. What he didn't know was that withdrawing such a large sum would take time. The banks were closed that day for a holiday, and Scott had work the next morning, which meant he couldn't access the money right away. This gave me the perfect opportunity to carry out my plan. I spoke with my doctor and got permission to leave the hospital briefly. Tomorrow would be the day I set my revenge in motion. I could barely wait. The next day I went home under the excuse of picking up some belongings, but my real reason was to check on something else. As I entered the living room, I noticed 3 papers lying on the table, a divorce application and a hastily written letter. The letter read, "Sorry for the rush, but let's get divorced. Please sign and submit the divorce papers." I checked the shelf and confirmed my suspicion. The ATM card was gone. Scott had taken it. Most people would feel devastated to lose such a large sum, but instead, I felt a small smile creep onto my face. "Operation successful," I whispered to myself. If Scott had been there, he would have been furious, demanding to know what I meant. I started by filling out the divorce application, putting an official end to our relationship. Then I packed the essentials I needed for my stay in the hospital. Leaving the house we had shared for years felt strange, but I didn't look back. On my way out, I submitted the divorce application, making sure our ties were truly cut. Back at the hospital, I prepared for the new challenges ahead, speaking with my doctor about my treatment and what I should expect. Later, while resting in my hospital room, I noticed multiple missed calls on my phone, all from Scott. He had also sent several messages, mostly asking about how to withdraw the money. To avoid disturbing my roommate, I stepped into the hospital's common area where phone calls were allowed and returned his call. Finally, I can't withdraw the money. Please tell me how to do it, Scott said, sounding more panicked than I had imagined. It seemed he needed the $800,000 urgently, but I felt no need to help him. If you can't withdraw it, then give up, I replied, keeping my voice calm and cold. Don't be so harsh, he pleaded. We were husband and wife, after all. Maybe we should help each other. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Husband and wife helping each other. His words felt like nonsense. Scott's actions had shown he only cared about himself, and I knew he was driven by nothing but greed. Are you really having trouble withdrawing the money? I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral. Yes, he answered, sounding desperate. I urgently need that $800,000. Please just tell me what to do. Hearing him so desperate was something new. It was almost amusing to hear him, usually so controlling. Now sounding so cornered, I almost laughed, but I kept myself composed and decided to give him the truth. The method you're trying is correct, I told him, letting the words sink in. But the ATM card you have now, it won't work anymore. There was silence on the other end as he processed what I had said. The card he had taken would no longer give him access to the money. I could imagine the shock on his face as he realized he had fallen right into my plan. I spoke plainly. The card won't work anymore. What do you mean? He shot back, disbelief in his voice. An ATM card should just work. Yes, normally it would, I replied, but the one you took is now useless. Why? He demanded, sounding both shocked and frustrated. Because I filed a report for a stolen card earlier today. The ATM card is now just a piece of plastic, useless to you, I explained calmly. There was silence on the other end as he tried to absorb the news. That morning, I had stopped by the bank and reported the card as stolen. Scott had taken it without my permission, planning to take the $800,000 I had saved up for himself. His actions were clear, theft, and I had every right to protect my money. Now the card he had was blocked, and he could no longer access any of those funds. On top of that, I had already submitted the divorce papers, ending any claim he might have thought he had as my husband. How does it feel to be outsmarted by the woman you always looked down on? I couldn't help add with a sense of satisfaction. I don't know what you needed the $800,000 for, but I'm not about to hand over that money under these circumstances. An edge of desperation filled his voice. I need that money right now. Please, I'll do anything. Just give me the money. His urgency was almost overwhelming, and I felt a sense of curiosity. What had he done that made him so desperate for such a large sum? Why do you suddenly need $800,000? What's going on? I asked, waiting for his answer. After a long pause, Scott started explaining. 3 days ago, when he learned about the $800,000, he impulsively quit his job, expecting that he would have access to my savings. He started spending recklessly, even gambling, and quickly ran up a debt of $600,000. Now the lenders were demanding that he repay the debt within a week, or there would be severe consequences. He had assumed he could solve everything with my ATM card, convinced the money was already his. Scott went on, telling me how he had been living lavishly, assuming that once he had the card, he'd be set for life. But when he tried to withdraw the money, he realized the card was blocked. Now, without access to the $800,000, he was in deep trouble. My future is in ruins without that money," Scott admitted, his voice full of desperation. He had abandoned the divorce papers he once left on the table and shamelessly reached out to me for help, hoping I'd feel sorry for him. But after everything he had done, I felt no pity for him. Scott's voice shook with fear. "I don't know what will happen if this continues," he said, sounding truly panicked. It was clear he wasn't lying. His reckless actions had finally caught up with him. He had gone wild, spending $600,000 in just a few days, blinded by the thought of easy money. I sighed deeply. The old me, the one who had once put up with his terrible behavior and tried to keep the peace, might have felt sorry for him and helped. But I was different now. The love I once felt for Scott was long gone, replaced with a sense of indifference. No matter how much he begged, I felt no pity. If anything, I felt a faint amusement that he thought I'd care enough to bail him out. But Scott kept pleading. "Please, you're the only one I have left," he begged. His constant appeals grated on my nerves. I wanted to free myself from this burden and focus on my recovery. This mess was entirely his doing, and I had no reason to help. If you had shown even a bit of concern for me as a husband and brought me my things when I asked, maybe I would have considered sharing some of the $800,000 with you, I told him. But you didn't. You only thought about yourself. I kept my tone firm. "I'm sorry, but I have no intention of giving you the $800,000 or helping you out of this mess. It's your responsibility to deal with the consequences." Scott's desperation grew. "Don't be so cruel. We were married, after all. You can't just erase everything we had because of one piece of paper." "What relationship?" I shot back, my voice sharp. "You've only leaned on me, taking advantage whenever it suited you. Now you're trying to manipulate me to get what you want. I refuse to waste any more time on you, and I won't give you the $800,000, no matter what you say." Scott's voice became frantic. "Please, Shirley, I'm begging you. You're the only person I can turn to. If you abandon me, I don't know what will happen." His words had a tone of blame, as if somehow I was at fault for his situation. But the truth was clear. His own careless spending had led him here. If he hadn't splurged recklessly, if he hadn't cut me out of his plans, he wouldn't be in this mess. This was entirely his doing. "Stop making excuses," I replied, my voice steady and cold. "You're just facing the consequences of your own choices. Handle it yourself." With that, I ended the conversation, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders. Scott had dug this hole, and now he would have to find his own way out. For once, I was free to focus on myself and my own healing. I ended the call with a firm final message to Scott. When he kept calling back, I ignored him and eventually blocked his number to stop any further communication. With the divorce papers filed and submitted, Scott and I were no longer connected in any way. He had officially released me. I shifted my focus entirely to the battle against cancer after experiencing a wave of relief. It was a long and arduous road full with treatments and difficulties, but I made it through. Upon leaving the hospital, I felt as good as new, as if I could begin anew. I found out about Scott's disappearance through a friend after I left the hospital. He had attempted borrowing money from friends and family in a desperate attempt after he lost touch with me and couldn't get any. He pleaded with them for $600,000, but nobody would lend him a dime because his demands were so urgent. It seems like he was experiencing more hardship than he had anticipated, but I had no idea what happened to him afterwards. I felt a sense of relief and contentment after realizing this. I chose to vacate the residence I had previously lived with Scott after my recovery. A new, serene, and completely my home was mine when I found it. I started working from home as well, relishing the autonomy and liberation that accompanied this new chapter in my life. I was relieved to finally be in charge of my life, and my financial situation was solid. My friends would occasionally inquire as to whether I was thinking about remarrying or finding a new partner. Any notion of getting married was swiftly banished by the terrible memories of my time with Scott. Living independently brought me so much serenity, and I had come to appreciate my independence. With a clean slate before me, I felt completely at home in my new house.